Welcome, everyone. I'm Raquel Willis. I am an author and consultant for GLAAD, and welcome to Community Conversations, Wellness and Justice in the Transgender Community. It is co-hosted by GLAAD and Arianna Center of South Florida, you heard the Southern, and powered by Gilead. In this conversation, we are elevating the fight for social justice for trans and gender nonconforming people and people who are taking on that fight in both powerful and joyful ways. So first we have Daniela Arroyo, who is our co-host from Arianna Center. Daniela is a human rights activist and the first trans woman to compete in Miss Universe, Puerto Rico. We also have Tori Cooper, who is with the Human Rights Campaign's Transgender Justice Initiative, and Schuyler Bailar, a writer and author and former NCAA athlete, one of our first out trans men to compete in Division I sports. We'll also have joining with us a little bit later, Darwin Thompson, who is the creator of Gilead's TRANScend program and Gilead Public Affairs Director. So let's start off here. For both Daniela and Tori, y'all can kind of tag team on this one. Can you share the mission of your organizations and initiatives and what you're advocating for?
So our mission at Arianna Center is to support the health and human rights of the transgender community in Florida. We advocate for inclusive healthcare access, legal protections, education, and awareness, working to eliminate health disparities among the community.
Amazing. And Tori, hop in here.
Awesome. Thank you all. What an esteemed group of panelists. At the Human Rights Campaign, we have a 43-year history of fighting to ensure that equality and access exists for all folks across the spectrum. I'm the National Director of the Transgender Justice Initiative, and we operate under 4 pillars, and they are strategic communication, economic empowerment, public safety, and capacity building. And so each and everything that we do is really geared towards bringing more equitable solutions around 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of those pillars.
Absolutely. And I think both of you kind of show how important it is for us to have this grassroots and statewide perspective. And then, of course, this national perspective in terms of fighting for trans rights and equality. And so this is so key because these forces are parallel. And then I'm going to bring in Schuyler, you here, because a lot of your work, I'm going to say you're a cultural organizer because you use various platforms to elevate trans rights and, of course, dignity. But you also have this rich story as a former athlete and someone who understands the ins and outs of sports in this country. So can you talk a little bit more, because we're in a time where a lot of the legislation has hinged on some of these inaccurate ideas of what it's like for trans folks to compete in sports. But why do you think sports became such a lightning rod used against trans folks and particularly youth?
Well, first, grateful to be here, Raquel, and with the esteemed other panelists, Daniela and Tori. The focus on trans people in sports, I always like to remind people of this, and I think it can be sometimes surprising. The focus on trans people in sports isn't about trans people or about sports. It's about policing people's bodies. It's about reducing bodily autonomy, and it's about rigidifying or boxing the concept of womanhood, and therefore policing who is allowed access to womanhood, which historically speaking has really been focused on a very specific type of woman, mostly white women, right? So there's a lot of really intersectional systems of oppression that impact this conversation about trans people in sports. And what we've seen is a very divisive and unfortunately effective manipulation of people's fears and sort of American public's fears about sports and about women and about safety to then demonize trans people. But the reality is that before this conversation arose about trans people in sports, 2 or 3 years ago, and suddenly people thought about trans people in sports, most of these people were not watching the NHL, the WNBA. They were not caring about women's sports or fairness in women's sports. they were probably actually not caring about it and actively discriminating against women athletes. So I could go on a whole tangent for the entire time we have to speak. I will not, but long story short, the attack on trans athletes and specifically trans youth is about controlling bodies, about trying to, quote, normalize bodies and trans youth specifically, not about protecting anybody, and especially not about protecting women.
Of course. Go in. See, you could tell Schuyler talks about this a lot and uses that platform so powerfully. Darwin, I also want to bring you in. So we've heard a bit from the grassroots state level perspective. We've heard a little bit from the national perspective. We've heard about from this cultural advocacy perspective as well, and lived experience. And so can you tell us a little bit more about why the trans community matters to Gilead and bring in kind of that industry healthcare perspective?
Yeah, I there's this quote that people say all the time that I believe in so much: until we all are free, no one is free. And so I think we have to ensure at Gilead that we are creating opportunities to ensure that everyone has equitable access, regardless of their gender identity, their sexuality. But then there's a double click on those populations that are historically marginalized. And so what I'll tap into here briefly is sort of the work that we're doing through our TRANScend initiative, right? It really is an initiative where we've contributed nearly $10 million to trans-led organizations, with over 90% of those organizations, I would even venture to say 95% of those organizations, being led by Black and Brown trans leaders. And really those initiatives are working to improve the safety of community, ensuring that they have access to, prevention options such as PrEP or other testing options, but also just a better quality of life. And what we've seen some tremendous outcomes, right? That they are leveraging the resources to get additional resources and funding from other funders, that we've seen leaders elevate their platform to a national level. But more importantly, we've been able to, through this initiative, directly support additional smaller grassroots-led organizations who may not have access to this funding, but will have access to another pot of funding to ensure that they're able to do their work. But then lastly, we want to ensure that these groups are sustainable. So thinking through what capacity building looks like, what organizational development looks like, we understand that there needs to be a little bit more of a white glove touch with our trans-led organizations. And we're hoping through our TRANScend initiative that we're able to do just a small part to ensure that everyone is free. Because again, until all of us are free, no one is free.
Period. Come on. You better give us a little Audre Lorde, honey. Yes. I love it. And I think it's so important for us to be tying these dots together around where industry, where companies and corporations can kind of fit into the social justice work that's happening on the ground. And with that, Tori, I want to hear a little bit more about you, because you're someone that I've seen from afar doing the work for a long time. Can you talk about how your advocacy for trans folks has evolved as the community has become more visible and unfortunately more vulnerable?
Well, I'll start with thank you for that, Raquel. And I'll start with the second part of that. As there is more visibility, there also comes more vulnerability there as well. The target becomes larger. The community becomes more visible. My advocacy personally has increased tremendously over the years, and it's also transitioned, if you will, for play on words. It's starting out, I'm older than everyone else on this call, and my earliest advocacy was helping to create flyers around sexual health and HIV prevention. And then from there, working with folks to figure out how to use verbiage correctly. And then over the years, it's transitioned to incorporate folks into providing cultural competency trainings for corporations and businesses and schools and all kinds of different things, and self-empowerment and financial literacy, and I could go on. So those are tools that many of us in the community never had. Those weren't lessons that we learned in school. Those weren't things that we got from our professional mentors. And so I think it's important that myself and some of my peers are sewing back into the community that we're a part of.
Yeah, I think as you continue to do this work, right, the issues just kind of compound and compound. And as you're saying, you see the connections on a national level with your work now of everything that you were doing before around HIV advocacy and support. And of course, what's happening in terms of discussions around reproductive health care. That is something that matters to trans people, folks. I know we don't say that enough, but that is also a thing. And then, of course, what's happening legislatively, specifically around access, for instance, to restrooms and on. And so, Daniela, that's where I want to bring you back in. Can you talk about how bills that restrict access, for instance, to restrooms or other spaces, how those bills are so harmful to trans folks and to people across the board?
Yeah, I feel they're very, very harmful because they falsely assume that gender identity aligns solely with biological sex. And that disregards the experience of transgender people. And it can lead to increased anxiety in people from the community, from the trans community, discrimination, and even potential harm to trans people in these facilities. And moreover, I feel it perpetuates a culture of exclusion, and it reinforces harmful stereotypes about people. So that's why I feel they're very harmful.
Absolutely. And that's where the political education is so key. And so I want to jump back to you, Schuyler, and talk a little bit more about your most recent effort. Of course, you dropped the amazing tome. Can you talk a little bit more about what maybe has surprised you about the reaction to the book and really just some of the work that you've been doing over the last few years?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that has always surprised me about doing this work, so I've given almost 500 speeches, trainings to businesses, schools, companies, corporations all around the country since I came out. And I've always sort of had this hesitation right before I give a speech where I think to myself, like, why do these people want to listen to me, right? What are they going to gain from what I have to say? Sometimes it makes sense because they're also athletes, or they're also trans, or they're also Korean American, or, they share an identity. But most of the time I'm talking to people outside of my community. So people that don't share an identity with me. And I'm always like, how am I going to connect these people? But I have consistently found a lot of connection and a lot of really surprising connection. And I'll have people come up to me after I've given a speech or a training, and they'll say, you know what, before I came here, I thought really negative things about trans people, or I didn't understand trans people, or I even, was transphobic. And now I've met you and I'm like, wait a second, you're just a person. And there's this breakdown of humanity essentially that allows people to connect. And I don't think it's specific to me. I think it's specific to the ability to cross a difference and sit with somebody's bare humanity and say, I'm actually not that different from you, right? And these specific things that we're using to call out our identities, such as being a person of color or being a trans person or being a queer person, we actually don't need to use them to separate each other. And so that's been a really powerful reminder to me. And it's been something that's reminded me with the book as well. Yesterday, I got an email that was this guy said, I'm this 65-year-old man and I never understood any of this before, but my kid came out as trans and they gave me this book and I feel like I'm finally learning. And I read this and was in tears because I was like, this is so powerful to have people who thought they couldn't learn actually begin to learn. And for me, sort of the central point I guess I'm trying to make, Raquel, is I think that we underestimate the power of connection, and we underestimate the ability for other people to connect across difference. And that's something that I always come back to as very hopeful, because the power that the anti-trans movement is using is the disconnectedness, right? They're depending on us disconnecting from each other and us fighting within each other and us breaking ourselves from the inside out. And we don't have to do that. We can rally together, even in spaces like this, where we connect and we unify, and we're so much powerful when we do that.
Absolutely. That's so key. I mean, meeting people face to face, right? I like to say people have a lot of energy, honey, behind the screen. And so, one of the things we said in a previous conversation was that there was cyberbullying, of course, particularly the trans youth face. But what so many folks on this call are doing are putting face and putting body and putting lived experience into this discussion around trans rights, trans equality, trans liberation, if you will. And so that is so key. So people understand we are real people, we exist out here. I want to kick it to you, Darwin, because you talked specifically about trans experiences. And I know one of the other pieces of the work that you're doing with Gilead is also particularly around how HIV impacts Black community, and how it also impacts folks, particularly living in the South. And that has been a focus of that work too. So can you talk a little bit more about why that's important, that kind of regional, and of course the race dynamic as well?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about all the isms or where Black folks live at, it's concentrated in the Southern US, particularly the Deep South. So when we think about, if we think about all the negative things, right? Poor access to transportation, infrastructure, access to healthcare, cultural competency, we could pinpoint it with health disparities in the Southern US, right? And so there is this belief that if we do well and we actually move the needle when it comes to HIV in the Southern US, then we will end the HIV epidemic nationally, right? And so I think there's a huge bet on that. And so I think that's why we took this regional approach to sort of to HIV, because I think that is where Black folks live at. That is where there's a concentration at. And so we need to work through ending the epidemic in the places where they live, work, and play.
Period. Okay. So with that, because I know both Tori and Daniela, y'all are both very familiar with the work that Gilead is doing, and particularly the TRANScend program. So we have a question teed up from Gilead grantee, Baltimore Safe Haven. And that question is really about what are some of the best ways to advise clients and community members to protect themselves when out in the world? Like, what do you want trans folks to know, and particularly allies, around the protection needed right now for our folks? And so maybe Daniela, do you want to start us off?
Yes, I would tell allies to, first of all, listen and learn. I feel you can really do a lot of help by just listening and learning about our experiences and, how it feels like and the best ways to help us. Also to advocate for inclusivity and, for more inclusive policies and be part of the fight that we have as a community, and also to intervene and support. Whenever you see a trans person, a trans friend, family being in a situation of discrimination or harassment, I think your voice is also very important in that moment. So that would be my advice.
And we can use the power of the ballot to really change policy and change the lives of our community. Making sure that there's infrastructure around you that is supportive, safe, and affirming for the trans community. That's also important. I think it's wonderfully ironic that the Baltimore Safe Haven, which provides safe, affirming housing and space for trans people in and around Baltimore, is asking that question because they provide safety for folks. And we need to see much more of that, particularly in the places where reproductive justice is at attack, because it's the same people where bathroom bills in 2023 are still being promoted. Those are the same adversaries where unions are being busted. There's a modicum of safety there. All of those things, and where people just aren't able to live their lives in the way that they should.
Yeah, so I'm hearing this intersectional approach being so key, thinking about economic safety and security thinking about physical safety and security and self-defense, the ability to defend yourself, and so much more. So thank you for that. Okay, so we are rounding off into our last few questions. Schuyler, I want to jump back to you. Of course, we mentioned before your history in sports and, of course, your advocacy for sports inclusion of trans folks. Can you talk a little bit more about why sports is so important, particularly for those young trans folks who are interested and passionate about it, like in terms of physical and both mental health care?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that I always say sports are a human right, and the reason that I say that is because the core of participating in a sport is really the ability to connect with one's body, right? To be in one's body, to have autonomy over one's body, to celebrate one's body, to feel connected to movement with one's body. And this is across ability as well, right? There's many different ways to connect with one's body. It doesn't have to be traditionally in a specific sport or a specific way to use one's body in a sport. But I think when we ban trans kids or any kids from participating in sports, we are stopping them from accessing their own bodies. And that is a grave dissociation and a removal, again, of body autonomy. And I think that one of the things I consider and that I really encourage others to consider when we think about excluding trans people, because people think that this is for the safety of our girls or women, is that when we try to exclude specific individuals, we actually have to police the entire category. And so people, think that they're protecting young people or young girls specifically when they're excluding trans girls. But what they're actually doing is they're enforcing the policing of all girls' bodies. And any girl can be accused of being trans. And at what point is a girl too tall or too strong, too masculine, too muscular to be then accused of being trans? We're actually already seeing this impact young people, where they're young cisgender girls who are not trans, being screamed at, being yelled at, being accused of being a boy, quote unquote, being accused of being trans, and then leaving competitions in tears because grown men are screaming at 9-year-old girls. So I think we really have to understand that sports lend kids a wide variety of benefits that mostly have nothing to do with competitive advantages or even any kind of competitive outcomes. It's access to one's body, its ability to build confidence through sport, teammate, community, right? Tenacity and learning how to work through barriers and challenges. And when we stop trans kids from accessing that, we actually are putting in danger all kids' ability to connect with their bodies on their own terms.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Schuyler. And thank you all on this panel for your candor, keeping it real, because we are living in some very real times. As we said at the top of this conversation, it's going to take all of us in our various different sectors to move the needle closer towards trans liberation. So I thank you all for the work that you're doing in your different arenas. And I hope that our viewers can understand maybe a little bit more about how all of this work is just our different threads in this larger tapestry. So thank you for listening to us, and check us on the next conversation.